We are having another good evening tonight. It's Sharia Crime Stoppers in the United West bringing you another webinar in our series. We've got, of course, Mary's here tonight. Good evening, Mary, and our news analyst, Christine Douglas-Williams. Good evening.
Great to be back, Dick, and great to have you all with us again.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we know we've got a lot of new people, and for that reason, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Christine, but I kind of want to mention we really appreciate your participation. We've been doing Zoom now for a while, and it looks like a lot of people are discovering Zoom. So we are certainly looking at our content. We've introduced a news analysis program with Christine and Claire Lopez, and that's really taken off. So stay tuned. There'll be new news about new things coming your way, but I want to really thank Christine for setting a standard on these news analysis. We're getting great feedback, and let me give you a little bit of background for those of you that are new. We have a lot of new people. So Christine Douglas-Williams is an international award-winning broadcast journalist. She's a news analyst and the author of 2 books, The Challenge of Modernizing Islam and Fired by the Government of Canada for Criticizing Islam. She's a former federal government appointee to Canada's Office of Religious Freedoms, as well as the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. She's a regular writer for Jihad Watch and an associate editor at FrontPage Magazine. Wow, we are truly blessed. And the good news is, I thank God that I believe, Christine, you've been healthy and your family's healthy, and people around you hopefully as well.
Yes, we are, and we wish the best for everybody on watching as well. And it's a privilege once to be here again, Dick. It's great working with you and Mary.
Well,
we enjoy every minute of it, Christine.
And Mary has got some things she's going to be supplying as support for video support for what Christine is going to talk about. And of course, we'll have you Q&A. Start writing your questions as we go through. And at this point, Christine, why don't you just kick off the news analysis, please?
Great. Okay. Thank you, Dick. And thanks for everybody for joining us. Now, the topic of the day, no matter where you turn, is coronavirus. It's something that you really can't escape. And of course, we're Sharia Crime Stoppers. So of course, we're going to be including an overview of the Islamic world and how it affects us and how they're approaching it, and the influence also in India, of all places, and also in Israel. Okay, so to start, a big caution that I'm hearing, and it makes sense, it's that the outbreak is a risk to increase the power of what's called the red-green axis. If you're unfamiliar with what the term means, as the name implies, red signifies communism, and that's the short version, and green signifies Islam. So that's what the red-green axis is. And there's, you know, in the West, it's a strong, unlikely alliance, but yet still an alliance nonetheless between the two, especially noted in the Western world, where leftists typically defend Islamic supremacists. And we know how counterproductive that seems, considering how feminists are vocal about female rights. And we know full well what's going on in the Islamic world, but they seem blind to that. There are a lot of other issues, like how gays are seen and so forth. But I'm not going to ramble about that. The point of the matter is, this virus, we have to be concerned. Now, there was a Breitbart article that was written by James Delingpole, and he addressed it quite well. In a nutshell, he advances that the coronavirus will pass. I mean, we expect it to, of course. What else will it do? It will eventually pass. I mean, we don't know what the damage of it will be, but he is worried about the damage done by excessive government meddling in the markets and elsewhere that could last, he's saying, for generations. This is what we should fear most, he's saying. What we should fight the hardest to resist. So what he's saying here is that we've got certain forces out here, specifically socialism and Islamism. And the point of the matter is they will exploit anything, any situation. And here we have this problem with coronavirus. The market's affected, bigger government, so we need to watch out for that. And he's right. There are tons of articles all over the place. Some are insisting that governments are overreacting. Others are saying, no, we should be doing even more. But we need to be listening to the medical experts because they are at the front lines. They know what's happening. And if you look at Italy, just as an example, I find it awfully frightening because right now they have a population of some 60 million, and they're experiencing now, and that's since Friday, an average of 800, going up to upward to 800 deaths per day. Now that's alarming. And it's a good thing to look at Italy and to learn. Now, although the majority of Italians now are following orders to stay inside, police are now fining. In fact, they have fined some 40,000 people in the first week of the lockdown, those who are insisting, oh, nothing can happen to me. I'm invincible. So especially some of the young people, and we're not going to target the young people, but there are some among the young that are thinking, oh, that's an illness where it's mostly affecting the older people. We're on March break. A lot of them are saying we're going to party and have a good time. No, and that's a problem. So Italy is getting really, really serious, and some even getting frantic. In fact, some of the mayors and the police are really giving out some serious messages to the point where police said outright, we're gonna start using flamethrowers at people if they're found wandering around the streets if they don't do anything. And this is how bad it's getting. And an Italian virologist, he actually blamed political correctness that he states doomed his country's coronavirus response. He indicated that Florence even launched, which we all know about, the Haga Chinese Day. And that was an initiative right after Trump announced that travel to China was restricted and back and forth. This is what they did. And this caused massive problems in Italy. So now the panic in Italy is on. And in fact, not just Italy, but all over the place. We all know about the toilet paper buying and the jokes that are all over the internet, which really does tend to lighten people up. It's a sad story, but it is lightening people up. But a nasty report, unfortunately, came to the forefront about nurses in the UK. Some of them are getting spat on, verbally abused, and even evicted, because these kinds of people that are attacking them are accusing them of spreading coronavirus. My question to those people is what would they rather? Would they rather medical staff just abandon hospitals? These people are putting their life on the line to save people. And some people are in such a panic that they're targeting the nurses on the front lines. I find that absolutely appalling. Now, the crisis that we're facing, maybe it's equally about the known as it is about the unknown. It has a lot of people frightened, and for good reason, because there's so much unknown. But I want to tell you, bring to the forefront some pieces of information that was brought to my attention. Someone reliable brought this one to my attention, that in a private hospital in Iran, where the ICU is completely overwhelmed, completely full, and many of these patients are showing symptoms not only of respiratory distress, but other symptoms that are similar to Ebola. That's frightening. So whatever your opinion is about this disease, there's something else that I managed to find. According to Merck Manual, there are 7 strains of coronaviruses, 3 of which are more severe, and that's SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV, and MERS-CoV. Now, MERS represents Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. And the last thing we need here is the spread of this kind of a virus. One thing that's also been at the forefront is, we all know this, we can't depend on the regime of Iran to tell us the truth. And some reports say that when you're in the sky, when you're flying over in a plane or whatever above, that you could see mass graves indicating way more than they're saying. I don't know what the situation there is exactly. We do know it's a mess, and we do know that lies are being told. And now I'm hearing from a reliable source that this is the kind of, these are the kinds of symptoms being found in this private hospital, and not only there, but people who are inflicted with MERS-CoV. Now, it was first isolated, this MERS-CoV, from a patient who died in 2012. Yes, 2012 in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Now, this woman didn't die just from severe acute respiratory distress syndrome, but she developed some Ebola-like symptoms of hemorrhaging. Quote, spontaneous, massive intracranial hemorrhage with intraventricular extension and tonsillar herniation, unquote. Now, this patient did not have any aneurysms, and she wasn't given any antiplatelets. The medical journal finally concluded that structural neurological damage is what caused the bleeding, and it was directly associated with MERS-CoV infection. From the vast majority of reports that we're hearing, the contagion currently spreading does not look like that strain, but we do not want that to continue to spread. Some are ignoring it, unfortunately. Some are ignoring warnings for religious purposes, as we're seeing in the Islamic world, and this is something we're going to be talking about. And the issue is creating havoc, where science, we see, is clashing with modernity, with the rigidity of normative Islam. Now, going over to Indonesia, an Islamic Revival Assembly was halted over coronavirus. 9,000 were reported to be put into quarantine. Now, we hear these kinds of reports, and we have to ask the question, which is a valid one. How do you quarantine 9,000 people, and how do you make sure that they actually stay in quarantine? But the point of the matter is, there was this assembly, and the event was organized by a group called Jamaat Tabligh, or it's also known as Tablighi Jamaat. This is a global Islamic missionary movement that urges Muslims to return to the way Islam was in the century of Muhammad. This is the kind of revival. So when we look at Islamic revival, we're looking at three kinds that are easily known and that people generally know about: a reform and a revival back to the 7th century, and then there is a quest to try to bring it into modernity, and that is a reform that's going on to try to make it more modern. And then you have a kind of reform that was utter deception that was brought together by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is known as a reformist movement that tends to resemble a lot of what we do in the West in terms of institutions and good works and so on, but we know what they really are. And the Muslim Brotherhood, their objective is actually bloody jihad, but they know how to make themselves like chameleons into whatever system they're in, and depending on how that goes, their true colors manifest themselves. For instance, Hamas, which is Muslim Brotherhood, manifests very differently there than, let's say, Muslim Brotherhood linked groups that we see in North America. Likewise, the manifestation of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So here's what happened also. That same movement to revive Islam back to the 7th century had a similar event in Malaysia called Tablighi Ijtima. And that was actually attended by 16,000 people, and it wasn't halted. It ended up branded as the ground zero for coronavirus outbreak in Southeast Asia, where 11 out of 12 people who tested positive for COVID-19 on March 16th in Cambodia had attended that particular event. Now over to Iran. That country is now torn between calls for social distancing and the Ayatollah Khamenei's lack of concern. Recall that we brought this to you before, that he was underestimating what this virus really was and calling for some kind of a health jihad. That was a term that nobody actually knew what he meant. He tried to put it forth like it's prayer, but then one never knows what he means by that. He's saying that this is not something that we need to be concerned about. We have to continue with our health jihad. We have to continue with our gatherings, because this is what's important to Allah in his view. So there have been calls by the mullahs to keep the shrines open in Iran. And the Shia clerics are continuing to pressurize the Ayatollah to keep those holy shrines open, where kissing and touching of the shrines is common, and where we've brought you before the information that some people are going so far, and I guess this is part of the health jihad, if you think about it, of licking the shrines in order to keep them clean to prevent other brothers and sisters in Islam from getting infected. That's the kind of a thing that's going on in Iran. And the most prominent doctors, on the other hand, in Iran are warning that millions could die of the virus. So here we see that real clash between a barbaric way of thinking and modern science. Now, based on the percentages that we're seeing of people dying, I've noticed that it depends on what you read. Some reports are saying 1%, some are saying like Italy 9%. And remember that 9%, because Italy is really a trouble spot. Remember that 9% refers to the entire death rate. It's not specifically referring to the younger people or the older people, it's the average of the entire death rate. And Iran and Spain also have a fairly high rate as well. What's troubling is this rate is going up. Proportionately, the rate is going up. And of course, it's higher among those who are vulnerable. One specialist also said that obesity was a factor. Well, obesity is an epidemic. So if that's a factor, as well as every illness combined, as well as an aging population, putting all that together, you got a lot of people that are at risk for that virus. So the best thing you can do is keep yourself away from public places. Try not to panic. Make sure you have enough, for a few weeks. When you look at the supply chain, people keep reassuring, yes, the supply chain is keeping up. We do see it dipping, but we see it going up as well. Now, okay, I'm gonna go back to the mullahs here. They also believe that to die of coronavirus, which is very, very dangerous while worshiping, means martyrdom. How do you beat that when you're a rigid thinker that's completely sold out to this kind of a thinking, and they say, look, you're going to die as a martyr if you happen to die of coronavirus, because you're getting together in the name of Allah and you're praying in groups and you're protecting the shrines. Therefore, you must be a martyr. That's pretty hard to beat for some of these groups. So that's a problem that we see circulating. And the impact of that on the rest of the world is, what about traveling? I mean, I'm going to be dealing with Canada later, like I always do, but although Justin Trudeau stopped non-Canadians from coming through the borders, we're still accepting people with dual citizenship and who are Canadian citizens. And what about where they've been? What about who they've been with? And later on, we're going to be showing you more about that and what to perhaps expect based on a couple of reports that we're going to show you. So some prominent clerics, as I indicated, are telling Muslims that the Quran promises martyrdom for that kind of a faith in Allah, despite pestilence like COVID-19. This is what they're saying. Some are sharing a Kurdish poem that reads like this: "You youths take the mosque's path. Do not care about what is on your way. Our mosque's congregation is far away from epidemics." Unquote. So this is what's being preached. On the potentially good side, and this is to be taken with guardianism, is that Iran is said to be scaling back jihad activity because of coronavirus. But at the same time, the US military also fears that that regime could become even more dangerous. So when you're looking at Iranian proxies and you're looking at their day-to-day activity, if you try to take a look at what this perhaps means, is that that kind of activity with the proxies has been scaled back. But who knows what it's planning? The military, the US military, does not trust what's going on with the regime and thinks the regime's back being against the wall could become even more dangerous. Now, this is something to also note, that amid the calls by anti-democracy players and irresponsible Western media, and these players like China, Pakistan, Russia, they've been all calling for Trump to ditch his, what they're calling cruel, callous sanctions on Iran because of the suffering to the people brought on by coronavirus. But here's what's going on here. Iran's been discovered to be diverting funds away from domestic needs to pay for its terrorist Revolutionary Guard Corps, and think about how they live. They have lavishly financed terrorist proxy forces across the Middle East and even across the globe. So when you think money is being spent on the people, the biggest lump is being turned over to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that should not surprise anybody. That should be expected. Iran has never shown any concerns for its people. No, it doesn't. It never has. Their main concern is to spread their poison globally. They've talked about revival of the Persian Empire, and they have their own vision of it, and this is what they're out for, and their proxies are global. So they're taking that money and putting it toward the Revolutionary Guard Corps. So no one knows what this desperate regime is planning next, and that is worrying. Now over to India, because we haven't been hearing much about India. There's an article in Jihad Watch that was authored by Shubham Sharma. It's entitled, "India's Citizenship Amendment Act, the Coronavirus and Muslim Defiance." Sharma is author for Asia Times and a journalist based in Delhi who writes mostly for foreign affairs and foreign relations. Now, we saw a reception of Donald Trump in India. That was an absolute magnificent reception, because India, of all countries, they know the history of what they faced under Islamic supremacism and the jihad. And they also know, of course, what they're dealing with a neighbor like Pakistan. Now, the interesting thing is, Donald Trump, who is being called racist, he was given a star reception in India. It was an amazing thing to look at. We actually featured it and showed you what the crowds look like here on Sharia Crime Stoppers, Make America Think Again. But here's this guy being called racist with that kind of a reception. Now notice that while he was there, the media really, well, they covered that news because they had no choice. Of course, some of them tried to find something wrong with what Trump did. There's always something they're trying to find wrong. But the thing is, he was given a big reception. Modi loves the guy. And while he was in India, he talked about the threat of jihad terror, of which the audience was loudly cheering, and they fully agree with and they fully understand. So so putting that aside now, we know that many people are up in arms over what they describe as India's treatment of Muslims through the Citizenship Amendment Act, which gives refuge to persecuted minorities in neighboring Muslim countries. So the persecuted people in those countries, due to Islamic supremacism, India is providing a place of refuge, but it's not letting in Muslim minorities. We know that Muslim on Muslim violence is brutal. And that is where the source is. People are saying, well, why are you barring Muslims? Since 1948, for example, some 11 million or more Muslims have been murdered by their own fellow co-religionists for being not Muslim enough from whoever the murderer, the jihadist was. So the thing is, though, when we're looking at a country like India and what it's suffering, how do you determine who's who? Because some of these same minorities who would have been murdered by their co-religionists, they will murder others in the name of Islam. So it's a real problem that India faces here, trying to protect its people. We know genocide is happening in the name of Islam in Africa. We know what's going on in the Middle East. Christians are being wiped out ongoing in the Middle East, and we know about what's happening in Africa now. It's actually being declared internationally by Amnesty International as a genocide, and people don't seem to care about what's going on with the Christians over there. But there is a major problem globally with Islamic supremacism and jihad, and that is obvious. And to talk about it, Jihad Watch is dedicated to human rights abuse committed to the name of Islam, and that site has been dubbed crazy Islamophobic. So in dealing with the issue of the India Citizenship Act, Shubham Sharma writes in Jihad Watch, quote, "The concept of Muslim brotherhood is prevailing over humanity and national security." Remember, his point of view is India now. "A report unveiled," he's saying, "by the Youth for Equality, a nation-building organization, reveals that Pakistan and some Islamic jihadist groups are funding this carnage to push India into a civil war. This organization has shown the official resolution passed by the Pakistani parliament describing how to drive India to the wilderness," unquote. This kind of MO should be obvious to everybody with even limited understanding about the Muslim Brotherhood. If you don't, it's easy to find out. Just look it up on the internet. The Muslim Brotherhood plan for North America is a great hint, and you'll get a glimpse of how they think. The project even was discovered by Swiss authorities in the Al-Qaeda Maghreb, and that's harder to find, but the material is clever, it's vicious, it's conniving and ruthless. This is how the Muslim Brotherhood operates, and this is how Islamic supremacism operates. Anything goes to spread their message. That's how they operate. So imagine, we can't even discuss openly the genocide against Christians, warning about the Muslim Brotherhood, which becomes violent increasingly according to its mandate. And so Sharma goes on to bring in the coronavirus issue as he addresses the situation in India. He writes that India is one of the few countries that's actually coping well under the fear and under the spread of COVID-19. And he attributes it to the strict steps that are being taken by the Indian government in the face of the crisis, like, for instance, ordering the shutdown of schools and colleges for a month. And employees are now, a lot of them are now working from home, and the public transportation is being meticulously sanitized. That's how he credits it. And he also adds, quote, "Indians," he says, "are much aware of their incompetent healthcare system and the scarcity of hospital beds. It was estimated by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, that there is less than one hospital bed available for every 1,000 people in India. So it becomes more necessary for Indians to avoid social gatherings and act according to the situation." But here's what's happening despite the Modi government's efforts. Muslims are being urged by their leaders in India to defy those precautions and told, quote, "Sharing food eaten by another Muslim leads to healing and not corona," unquote. So this is the problem that's happening there. And it's funny because in Western societies, we take measures. People call us racist. India takes measures. What then? They get ignored. So it's also happening in Israel, where the Arab population is doing the same thing. Israel is facing the outbreak like everybody else, and it's getting worrying, and it's come to the forefront. The Arab population is not listening to the orders to stay away from other people, according to the social distancing that we see happening today. So I'll say the obvious again, not all Muslims, it's never all Muslims, and that should be understood. How I wish that Muslims as a whole in the West will come aboard with everybody else, with Hindus, with everybody else, and say, look, This is a problem we need to beat together. But instead, you have Muslim Brotherhood linked groups that are claiming to speak for all Muslims, and they shout Islamophobia. And as a whole, the large Muslim community stays quiet, and it becomes a situation where it opens the door for anyone who gives logical criticism of Islam as being Islamophobic. We can't talk about these things openly, but right now we have a problem because we're dealing with not just a clash of civilizations anymore, not only the problem of Sharia and into the West, not only the problem of Jihad, but now we're dealing with the same mentality that's governing these kinds of barbaric nations. We're dealing with it now in other Western countries where they may not adhere to it, or they may have been part of those gatherings and now coming back home to the West. So that puts the global population somewhat in danger, depending on the levels of different people they have in the population that choose not to listen to the social distancing. A topic from the website Op India, quote, Islam above coronavirus safety, users take to TikTok to spread falsehood, launch campaign against social distancing. The article begins, as if information on WhatsApp was not enough, Muslim users have now taken to TikTok, unquote. They're encouraging close social gatherings for Muslims. In a video that was displayed, that this article talks about, a man in a black shirt is displayed. He's greeting his three friends, and when one of the friends refuses to shake the hand of this guy in this black shirt, citing concerns about coronavirus that may ultimately lead to his death, the man in the black shirt decides to give him an Islamic lesson. He says, quote, you will leave Sunnat, which means traditional Islamic custom, today, and Islam tomorrow due to your fear of death. We are Muslims, and therefore we are not afraid to die, unquote. His reluctant friend, now supposedly enlightened by his teachings about Islam, then proceeds to hug the man in the black shirt. Now that brings us to Canada now. I stated in my second book, and I'm going to hold that up here, Fired by the Government of Canada for Criticizing Islam. And yes, it's my story. The first half of the book deals with my story about being fired by the Government of Canada for criticizing Islam as a director on the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And the second half deals with, well, mainly the red-green axis and how the anti-racism industry has basically been hijacked by an us versus them manipulative force that really has no interest in race relations, as they try to say. It's basically us versus them. In other words, white people versus everybody else, which is absolutely disgraceful. It's racist against whites. It shows complete lack of knowledge of the racism that exists within groups, because yes, racism also exists within groups very much. And it also completely is an insult due to its bigotry of low expectations. You can't discuss issues that go on in the Black community, Black on Black violence. You can't talk about Islamization of the West. You can't talk about these issues of FGM. You can't talk about issues of Jihad. Otherwise, you're Islamophobic. Come on. Let's have expectations of everybody, not just of white people. Just because you're a person of color does not mean you have a right under Western civilization to be beating your wife or covering her from head to toe with her eyes peeking through, because the Quran does say so. Now, okay, so going back now to what's going on in Canada, I stated my point in that same book, Fired by the Government of Canada for Criticizing Islam, that we share a continent. So when one sneezes, the other catches a cold. And now we're seeing it quite literally with coronavirus. It's nothing to make light of, but this is what's happening here. And fortunately, I have to say that Trudeau has been taking precautions, as have provincial leaders. Now, Rebel Media highlighted some Trudeau concerns that we'll tell you about shortly. But it's, of course, concerns to you. Although the border is closed, that makes it much easier actually now. But just to let you know what's going on in Canada here. The provinces that have declared a state of emergency so far, Ontario, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, have all declared a state of emergency, and social distancing is becoming a norm now, much like the US, and the worst hit is Ontario and BC. Now today, just today, Quebec ordered all non-essential businesses to close as cases surge to 628. Now, looking at the numbers in Canada, again, the two provinces that are most hit are Ontario and BC, but there are sites that you can go to. If you just simply type in coronavirus Canada, you'll see what some of those numbers are if you happen to be tuning in from Canada. And the borders between Canada and US, although they're closed to non-essential travel, Ottawa is also urging all Canadians, and that includes the snowbirds. Now, in case any of you are tuning in and you're wondering, what's a snowbird? That refers to Canadians that go south to Florida in the winter, or if you happen to be living out west in BC, that would be California. So airlines have canceled thousands of flights that are coming in worldwide, and some airports have shut terminals. So if you're not driving to the south, you're taking a plane. Trudeau has warned everybody to come back as soon as you can while you still can, because that's something to note, that airports in Canada and airline services are shutting down pretty rapidly. So you'll have to check what's working and what isn't, which airport's taking who, and for how long as well, based on projections. So that is a big issue that's going on in Canada now. But here's another issue that was a worry to Canadians up to last week. And this has been ongoing for some time. And according to what Rebel Media says, it still should be a worry. This is about Roxham Road, Canada's dirty little secret that I've mentioned before in Quebec, where illegals have been slipping through in that Quebec border. It's a little route coming in called Roxham Road. Some numbers say now it's up to 50,000 at least illegals have entered that space. And Trudeau knew, and he did nothing about it. And they came from all over the Middle East and Africa. They started out mostly from Haiti, but rather than close off Roxham Road completely for a host of reasons, like security reasons, illegality, coronavirus now, the cost and so forth, the Minister of Public Safety had said that asylum seekers will be, quote, subjected to medical tests by border officials to detect potential symptoms of the virus, unquote. And by the way, who's been paying for all these people coming in, especially now, because many longtime hardworking Canadians are off work. They're scrambling to figure out the impossible task of what to do, what next. So who's paying for them? As it turns out, due to an outcry and unflattering coverage by Rebel Media ongoing, the government decided to state to the public that it closed off Roxham Road, but did it. Now we have a video ready for you to show that Rebel Media did, and we're going to show you part of that video because they took cameras out to Roxham Road. So we want you to have a look at that video. Take a look now.
Justin Trudeau has finally admitted defeat when it comes to Roxham Road. It only took him 4 or 5 years to do so, and it only took a global pandemic to make it happen. But Justin Trudeau has finally decided that Roxham Road needs to be closed. He's reached an agreement with the feds in the United States to send any illegal aliens across the border back to where they came from. Watch this.
Today, Canada and the United States are announcing a reciprocal arrangement where we will now be returning irregular migrants who attempt to cross anywhere at the Canada-US border.
Now, Rebel News has been on this beat for years. We're the only outlet that has been on the ground critically covering what is going on, showing Canadians exactly who is coming into this country and why they're coming into this country. Now, we've been covering it from Roxham Road all the way to Parliament Hill when I spoke with MPs just last week, asking them if we should be quarantining them. Now, keep in mind, this was before any borders were closed at all. Listen to what Bob Benson had to say.
Well, I think that the thing we have to be concerned about is we don't know where they're coming from, who they've been in contact with. So what I would do is on just a precautionary basis, I personally think we should quarantine them. How do we know who they've been in contact with? I mean, there's a lot of cities being locked down right now. I see Governor Cuomo in New York is locking down a city this afternoon. Maybe they came from there. I mean, did they come? How do we know? So in the best interest of Canadians, in the short term, we have to be safe and we have to secure our borders. And I would be in favor of quarantining them until we know where they came from. As soon as we knew where they had been and they were safe, I mean, I would let them out of the quarantine. I would make sure it's as short as possible, but I think we need to keep Canadians safe.
Now, he was the only MP that actually called for the quarantine of these illegal aliens. Well, it turns out that was only the beginning. I went to Roxham Road myself right after that to see if illegal aliens were still coming into this country, and that was after Justin Trudeau announced that the border was going to be closed. Not only are foreigners not allowed in the country anymore, the American-Canadian border was closed, but somehow there remained a hole in the border. Somehow Roxham Road remained immune to government policy. We didn't really understand it, but now it looks like Justin Trudeau has walked back on that. Justin Trudeau has decided that those illegals need to go home. It's unfortunate, though, because it seems like that's not going to be retroactive. Any illegal alien that got into this country before Justin Trudeau made that announcement, well, they're safe by the bell. They're in government facilities in isolation. Many of them might even be sick. They came into this country wearing masks, as I saw earlier this week. Those masks could be signs of illness. They could be signs that they're overly cautious. It was only a matter of time before one of these illegal immigrants came to this country with the Wuhan coronavirus. It could have been another illness entirely. The main point being that they were taking away precious healthcare resources away from Canadians. Healthcare is a scarce resource, and those illegal immigrants are still going to be taking up beds from Canadians. They're going to be taking up border services agencies. They're taking up government time that can't be wasted on distractions. Now, of course, the main...
Okay, well, that was one video. And going over to Pakistan, Pakistan has actually been diligently screening for COVID-19 by taking the temperature of passengers in airports using a scanner. But in Canada, despite Trudeau and Bill Blair's promises to heighten screening, nothing was being done as flights from China, Iran, Pakistan, Dubai, Bogota, and other countries continue to arrive at Toronto Airport. Passengers are only being asked, how are you feeling today? Are you symptomatic? And go into self-quarantine. Now, Rebel Media did another video going to the actual airport in Toronto to find out what was happening. So take a look at that video.
Pakistan is a third world country, less cases than Canada. US and Canada has much more cases. I'm coming from Pakistan. I was there for 2 weeks. You see a lot of precautions, much more measures than a Western world, like, Canada.
Hey guys, I was just wondering, I was speaking to the arrivals from Karachi, and they were saying there was no enhanced screening at Canada Customs. David Menzies for Rebel News here at Toronto's Pearson International Airport on Wednesday afternoon. Now, folks, at midnight, the new travel restrictions kicked in. These are the ones that were announced on Monday by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And what the Prime Minister said on Monday was that Canada is shutting the border to non-Canadian citizens with limited exceptions to, of course, limit the spread of COVID-19.
We will be denying entry to Canada to people who are not Canadian citizens or permanent residents.
Now, there are exemptions to the rule that would include permanent Canadian residents, the immediate family members of Canadian citizens, diplomats, air crews, and U.S. citizens. They're evidently still being allowed into Canada at this time, but as you know, the COVID-19 story seems to change on an hourly basis. In any event, I'm here in Terminal 3 awaiting the arrival of a Pakistan International Airlines flight coming in from Karachi, and I want to find out who these people are and whether or not they have been subjected to enhanced screening measures. You know, like the enhanced screening measures Bill Blair bragged about in a recent tweet that he said took effect the moment the coronavirus was found to be a threat. And as you know, folks, we've come to the airport since January, and there's been absolutely no evidence of what Bill Blair is talking about. So the flight's due in any minute now, and let's see what these arrivals have to say. Excuse me, guys, did you just get off the flight from Karachi? Yeah. Oh, okay, then I'm just asking people, sir, did you experience any enhanced precautions here? Yes.
Yeah, of course. They were like twice. They gave us the information. The officers asked us the question twice, and they made sure we don't have any symptoms. And they asked us where we've been, like if we went outside of where we declared. and they hand out this information twice to us. They asked us to stay at home for 14 days.
Well, we have this not really screening, but we got all these brochures and details on self quarantine for 14 days once we arrive here, and the information where we can contact if we have some we notice some issues or anything. So these are the stuff that they are heading in.
Over here, yeah, they were giving different information. They were checking on us that whether if everything was okay in Karachi.
Actually, when we were in Karachi, there was a lot more people wearing gloves and masks in the airport. Really? Yeah. So that was something that was from military levels all the way through to security, even people checking bags. So seems to be a lot of awareness there as well.
No, I mean, it was pretty standard. Yeah.
No one externally took your temperature or anything like that?
Not at Pearson, no.
Not really.
Okay, that's interesting. So no one externally took your temperature?
Information, everything. No, nobody took the temperature or anything.
And sir, did anyone take your temperature here at the airport, like even remotely?
They asked us if we have any symptoms, but I haven't seen anyone take it.
Oh, so they asked, but they didn't actually...
Actually didn't do it. They did it back home when we were flying from there. And even when we were arriving there in Islamabad, they did check our temperature.
Do you know, did anyone remotely take your temperature to, check if you had a fever or anything like that?
No, I haven't noticed that. No, nobody does. And actually, I was expecting that somebody would be taking temperatures.
No, that's interesting. We thought that might, because this is the first day of the new enhanced screening, but you didn't see any of that yourself?
No, I haven't. These are the only information that we got.
Now, as you can see, wow, the people being interviewed were very polite, helpful, cooperative, but they made one thing very clear, that in their country, tests were being done, and they were surprised that in our country, they weren't being done. This constant political correctness, we saw what happened to Italy, that's the last thing we need here. And they expected to be tested, and nothing was being done. So all these promises that are being made, there's no follow through, except of course by rebel media. Now, I mentioned before Bill Blair. Many of you won't even know who he is. I have to remember here, I'm talking from Canada. He's the Minister of Public Safety and took over from Ralph Goodale. That's who that is. So he's been reassuring Canadians along with Justin Trudeau that, hey, we have nothing to worry about. People coming in are being screened. And as you can see for yourself, not really. Okay, so that brings us virtually to the end of coronavirus talk for now, because we'll return to it, I'm pretty sure, when we go to the Q&A part of our briefing today. So to go over a couple of other issues with some of the time we have left in brief, going over to Germany. Okay, now the deputy leader of the so-called populist Alternative for Germany party, Beatrix von Storch, she's demanding that Turkey be removed from NATO for the stunt that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, pulled by releasing all these migrants to go through Greece. Now, that news has kind of gone down because obviously coronavirus took over everything. But the point of the matter is still that Turkey has always had this dream of reviving the Ottoman Empire, while Iran has a dream of the Persian Empire. And together, their proxies are working globally. It's not just Iran, it's also Turkey. They're also funding radical mosques globally. So you've got the major funders of Iran, of Turkey, of Saudi Arabia, funding mosques all through the West. And you look at a man like Erdogan, his mission from the beginning was the Hijra, to flood Europe as much as he can with Muslim migrants to basically overtake Europe. And he has made no bones about it. He has spoken openly about it, called Europe a sick man, and said that the only hope for Europe is having Muslim migration. He's come right out and said it. Now, Van Storch is saying he should be kicked out of NATO. And I cannot understand what this enemy of the West is doing in NATO. So she certainly has a very valid point of view. Now, going over now to Germany, this is an interesting point, and it's just basically an FYI, because we hear about the Kurds, and yes, they are under a lot of oppression, but not every Kurd is friendly. To give you a little background, they're mostly Sunni Muslims, and they're largely covered in the media, which is true, as a persecuted minority, especially under threat, which is also true by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now, in January 2018, and Jihad Watch covered this, 90,000 mosques prayed Quranic conquest prayers calling on Muslims to be, quote, ruthless against unbelievers. Now, they were referring to the Kurds here, and for victory against the Kurds, right before thousands of Turkish soldiers were dispatched to, quote, the purpose from Erdogan to decimate the Kurds, unquote. However, among the Kurds, okay, as much as you do have those who are being targeted, they're also jihadists, and many of them have joined the Islamic State, and they were murdering their own people. In fact, the jihadist group called Ansar al-Islam, this means partisans of Islam, that was formed in 2001 in Iraqi Kurdistan by former Al-Qaeda members. They imposed strict Sharia law in the villages that they overtook and controlled near the Iranian border. So this guy who made his way into Germany, Fatah Mohammed Abdullah, he's one among the jihadist Kurds who ended up an asylum seeker in Germany, and he pled guilty to bomb making and inciting 2 Iraqi jihadists to commit a planned terror attack in northern Germany. He ended up buying chemicals, over 8,000 matches, an igniter fuse, and a remote-controlled detonator on eBay and Amazon. And like most migrants, he easily got into Germany. He was smuggled into Britain on the back of a lorry when he was 20, and he claimed to be Iranian when he arrived and was granted asylum, and he moved his way on from there. Germany actually admitted way back in 2016 of losing control of hundreds of thousands of migrants. Notice now how the globalists have gone silent over the migrants, but they have lost control, and that cannot be forgotten because it bears huge implications, especially now that Germany and other Western nations have put up billions of dollars for these Muslim migrants, many of them, not all again, to be put at the head of the queue, and we know the problems that were posed by this nightmare that we see. And Jihad Watch covers it all the time. We won't get into all of the news now, of course not tonight. Tonight we're dealing with the issue at hand, which is coronavirus and some of the other issues that came up in the news more recently. But we cannot forget the problem that Europe still faces with the hundreds of thousands, in fact, God knows how much, collectively millions of migrants that they've lost their whereabouts, don't know where they are, and how are they paying their social benefits, considering now what's actually going on as a result of coronavirus. That's something to ponder. Now, a coalition of Muslim groups, and we're into the US now, have launched a $1 million campaign to get Muslims to vote in 2020. The Democrat 2020 campaign to influence the Muslim vote is actually called the Million Muslim Votes Campaign, and is described as an unprecedented $1 million effort to find and persuade Muslims to participate in the 2020 general election. We have something called the Muslim vote here in Canada too, and the voting guide was found to be severely anti-Semitic, and still we don't hear anything about it further. So the author of that is quite well known, and she's an advisor to the federal government. She continues to make trouble, and again, no follow-up on that. So these groups now that this Democrat 2020 campaign is allying with is expectedly unsavory Muslim Brotherhood-linked groups like CARE, the Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition, the Empower Change, and the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And we covered that at Jihad Watch too, with links, full links. You can go to that story if you look it up, and you'll find more information about it. And recall, Bernie Sanders said, "We will stand by our Muslim brothers and sisters no matter what," no matter what, unquote. The next item, watch Minnesota. It's a problem spot for Islamization, and that's quite well known for people who have been watching. And an update, a Pakistani doctor and former Mayo Clinic research coordinator was arrested last Thursday in Minnesota on terrorism charges. Now, Mohammed Massoud pledged allegiance to ISIS and plotted jihad massacres in the US. Imagine that, a Mayo Clinic research coordinator. Some report says he was a doctor, but he was there on a work visa with the task of healing. And there he was, pledging allegiance to ISIS and plotting murders on American soil. And also in Minnesota, there's a Lutheran pastor that said, quote, listening to and learning Muslim values is one of the ways to get to know your neighbor, unquote. And he's dedicated to teaching that to his church. So once a month, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, pastors in the Southeastern Minnesota Synod, they gather to share educational resources and presentations related to faith. So the Reverend Mark Johnson of First English Lutheran Church in Faribault invited the pastors in his synod to tour the Abu Bakr as-Sadiq Islamic Center Mosque in Faribault. That mosque has been linked to al-Shabaab in Somalia. An article in the Minnesota Post mentions it in its report. Sudden notoriety, mosque in Minnesota draws scrutiny from US Senate, FBI, and international media, unquote. And a Fox News article recently reported how Minneapolis's Somali community became the terrorist recruitment capital of the US, unquote. So beware who your friends are. Many that go under the umbrella of Christianity have allied themselves with the very forces of Islam that are against Christianity, but pretend to be their friends. And Christians, meanwhile, are being persecuted internationally while they're socializing with the worst under the umbrella of peace and harmony and togetherness and diversity. But do not dare mention the issue of Islamization in any conversation about diversity, because that does not get allowed in such discussions. And that brings us to a close of the news briefing today. And of course, we're going to bring back Mary and Dick, or one of you, back to go into our question and answer.
Thank you very much. And I think the videos are very important as well. We are going to get to questions. A large response tonight. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of just comments or questions if you can, and then we'll go to the other questions. You mentioned a group that held a meeting, a concession of 9,000 people. I think it might have been in Pakistan or Indonesia. Tablighi Jamaat, I think was what you called it, back a ways. And the reason I mentioned that name is very familiar to people who follow the life and work of Philippine. If I'm not mistaken, that is exactly the same group that Philip tried to warn America about. That's the same group that is associated with Orlando. That's the same group that's associated with San Bernardino. So thank you for putting that dot, connecting that dot. It is really important. These people are alive and well in America. If I heard this story right, 9,000 people attended an event and then they attempted to quarantine 9,000 people.
Yes, that was in Indonesia, but let's not forget that the same thing happened also in Malaysia, and that was a lot more people. That was 16,000, and it was by the same group, and it went ahead. So this is a very influential group. So I'm happy that you're kind of raising that again under the banner of what Phil Haney was trying to warn about.
And so those are people that are in America, they're in Canada. It's a similar mentality. They live in our country in general, as we know, with very little exception. They have no motivation to assimilate. So what's in the head of somebody who's associated with that group in another part of the world is also likely in the head of those same people roaming around North America. I just wanted to make that connection. The other notion you mentioned is this notion, if you somehow die after you've been worshiping and associating, this notion of martyrdom and paradise achievement because you die of a disease. And I think this brings up the whole notion of the 7th century mentality that Allah wants you to spread this kind of a disease and you will be rewarded for that. Just stop and think about the mindset of people who would speak about, talk about revelation from that Allah, that God, and would position Muhammad as the messenger. And I mean, to me, it's in time for us to be thinking about that, as well as the fact that we have had policies in Germany and Europe and Canada and America to allow those people to come and wander in our country. By the way, you also mentioned Canada, but I think Canada signed the International Migrant Compact,
yes,
which gave just pretty much the open right of massive migration into Canada, into Germany, into Italy, etc. And we see now that those countries that just within the last year signed that compact are having major, major problems. Obviously, Italy is devastated. 60-year-olds and above are not being given ventilators, simply based on their age. It'll be interesting to see how long that's tolerated. I would think when you get to matters of life and death, there are plenty of 60 and 65-year-olds and their families who are not going to just accept that. Maybe I'm wrong, but we have a question from the audience about Italy, asking, really just kind of looking for detail related to why it was that Italy was in such bad shape. Let's see here. Let me get to
Dick,
that.
if I may interject real quick before we go to
Please.
the Q&A,
Yep.
a couple things you mentioned that struck me as well. As much as we've talked about Minnesota being so dangerous and all that you gave us on the information going on there, I think of Minnesota is dangerous to the United States because of what's going on, but it's also dangerous to Canada because it's right on the border.
That's right.
So we both are experiencing dangers from a state that has been taken over. And that's critical for both sides to think about. And the other thing to kind of add to Dick's talk about, when you said we are Muslims and not afraid to die, I remember thinking or hearing or reading early on when we started the whole war with Iraq and everything, that this was going to be a new type of enemy that was not afraid to die. In the past wars, it was always, I want to live, let's fight the enemy and we will win this. But this is martyrdom for death. They're happy when they are finally dead. That's what they've been bred with. That's what they've been taught. That's what they've grown up knowing. And they have no fear whatsoever. Except that you did mention, I think, the one Muslim that didn't want to shake hands, didn't want to be hugged, but he got hugged, I thought was quite comical. But now they are becoming martyrs in a whole new method with COVID-19.
And the problem was the same guy that I mentioned, he was eventually won over to the doctrine that he'll be a martyr. And there's something else that I want to emphasize, and I believe I mentioned it, but just in case I missed it, when you talked about how Minnesota affects Canada, there's also how Canada affects the US. And we've discussed this many times, Mary, you, myself, and Dick, that we need to see ourselves, especially in an era of globalization, we need to see ourselves as a continent. We're on one major landmass here.
Right.
Let's not forget, and I keep mentioning this for a reason, that back in 2012, the Iranian embassy in Ottawa had to be shut down because of the activity that was going on there between the embassy and the regime of Iran. This posed a major, major problem, and they had to shut it down because of the activity. So obviously that posed a danger to the US because there were calls to infiltrate Canada and then attack the United States.
Sure.
So listen to something else that came out that I need to emphasize again today. The coronaviruses that were linked to Iran, this is an article that came out with BBC, have been linked to these countries, have been reported in these countries. Take note: Afghanistan, Lebanon, Pakistan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Oman, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Canada. That was the list. Canada was the only Western country on that list that had cases linked to Iran. There is still a major link going on between this government and Iran, which has been historic. And even after that embassy was shut down, there were efforts to reopen it, particularly by Johari. That is an MP in Canada, Majid Johari. He has been trying to reopen that embassy and so-called diplomatic relations with Iran. You can't possibly have diplomatic relations with Iran. There's nothing diplomatic about Iran. And this is the problem we still face, even with coronavirus. I found that quite disturbing, which came out of the BBC, that Canada was the only country mentioned there among those other states.
And then we talked a little bit before we came on and broadcasted this, is the immigration that's still happening, the refugees that are still being brought in. Some 3,000, over 3,000 have come into the United States between January and March. and 9 of them, I mean, 9 doesn't sound like a lot, but 9 of them came from Iran.
There you go.
What is it with COVID-19 and the refugees? Why isn't that also halted and put to rest?
And not enough is being talked about the various types of coronavirus, like the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome.
Yeah.
That's not really getting discussed. There is so much still delicate tiptoeing around this whole political correctness. At first, don't dare say it's from China. And now with this MERS going on, COVID, why aren't we talking about that as well and really educating the public on the various strains of this virus, what is going on globally about it, and how we can protect ourselves? And again, as you put it, with Iran, that is a trouble spot.
Let me just clarify for everybody, the MERS-CoV, is that C-O and then the letter V?
Yeah, C-O, yeah, it's kind of written with a big C, a small O, and a large V. So it really means coronavirus. So
Gotcha.
It's a strain, MERS, yeah.
Okay.
The Middle East, yeah, right.
Okay.
It's one of the 7 strains.
Just wanted to clarify that for everybody.
And what Dick said about the UN Migration Pact, Canada, by the way, swore and promised, vowed to lead the charge with the UN Migration Pact, which again is on hold, given the catastrophe that we're facing now with this fallout.
You also mentioned another dramatic situation with Turkey. So for Turkey, it's not on hold. Turkey is a supplier of migrants to cross into Europe. And Erdogan aggressively has sprung, if I understand it right, thousands of migrants and helped deliver them to the border with Greece recently to as a weaponizing human beings. Movement of human beings is a weapon because he did not achieve some political objective related to either EU support or acceptance or whatever. So this is another 7th century mentality, except he's the president of the country with the largest army, 2nd largest army in NATO, and he is willing to spring and actually provide government transportation to the border with Greece as a retaliatory measure against Europe. Fortunately, the Greece are not letting it happen this time. But I mean, the notion that you would use people in the age of coronavirus to move into another country, and it's not just Hydra, it's almost like weaponizing a human being. You weaponize a human being.
It evolved, it ended up becoming this, but he has been threatening for an awfully long time, for the past few years, to open the gates if EU did not give him the money to take care of Syrian migrants. The problem is this, Europe did. He was given over $1 billion, and still that wasn't enough because it never really was about the money, it was about the Hijra. And what happened was he ended up releasing some 100,000 for starters, and he was even found to be arming them with tear gas. And in addition to that, it also came to the surface, and Breitbart wrote about this, that most of the migrants that were coming into Greece, they weren't from Syria at all. They were from Africa. They were not from Syria. North Africa. So this is a major problem we're seeing here, and they were from other territories that are not at war in the sense of what's going on with the Syrians, because he's trying to make it look like he's trying to help out the Syrians. In fact, when Syrians were actually trying to break through his border, this was reported months ago on Jihad Watch as well. His forces were opening fire on women and children coming in. This is what was going on with Erdogan. He was opening fire on women and children coming in, but yet he's sending them to barge through the border of Greece, arming them with tear gas. And not only that, but these people coming through that border, which most of them aren't even Syrians from what they were saying, they were using trees as trunks, as battering rams to come through, as well as the tear gas, and were lighting tires on fire. So it was becoming full-scale war at that border. Now things have cooled a little bit because of what's going on with coronavirus. And the EU that was for years saying, open the borders, open it wide, even tormenting Eastern Europe and taking them to EU court because they won't taking their migrant quotas. All of a sudden, the EU has gone silent. If not silent, they've been saying, you know what, back off, Erdogan, because they're seeing now that with the migrants coming in, this is going to exacerbate the problem of coronavirus.
I think another comment, since we're talking about refugee resettlement a little bit here, remember that in America, you can be a legal refugee with all of the benefits that you get, You might even have gone to Minnesota. You might have been from Somalia. But even though you were quote a refugee, you get to go home. You get to go visit. So the notion that we have traffic back and forth from third world country into America, back to the third world country, this has been going on for years. There's 100,000 Somalis in America. I'm certainly not suggesting that they have. I don't know anything about the connection between Somalis and the virus, but I'm simply pointing out how ludicrous it is that we have that. The other comment you made was about the Lutheran pastor from the Evangelical Synod within the Lutheran Church. The Lutheran Church, that particular part of the Lutheran Church, not the Missouri Synod, is not involved in refugee resettlement. I always have to say that. But the other ones, the other Lutherans, have received over $500 million of taxpayer money for moving bodies into Minnesota and Michigan and all over the world. So these Lutheran pastors, in addition to moving to the left and associating with the Chrislam movement, which we talked about last week, they've accepted lots and lots of money for moving people and getting paid for it, whether or not those people were vetted for their belief system. And frankly, based on what I know about the health screenings, leave a lot to be desired. So this whole notion of refugee resettlement, which Mary, good point, you mentioned it's still going on. These are all things for the president to get on top of. He's got an amazing list. But even after dealing with the crisis, we have major, major structural problems. I think he made a reference, I heard today, to the State Department, and he referred to them as the deep state, which is obvious. The State Department is loaded with carryovers from the Obama administration, people who have been processing the movement, the human trafficking of Americans under contracts, and they need to be, the whole thing needs to be disbanded. So you rang a lot of bells tonight already. And Mary, I guess we should get to the questions, right?
Probably should. Go ahead.
All right. Okay, here we go. The first question basically is, I heard that Italy had a bunch of Chinese workers working there. In context, went back for the Chinese New Year, then came back to Italy. Well, yes, it is the case. Christine, I'm sure you're aware, the northern region of Lombardy.
Lombardy, yeah.
Yeah. Has a definite connection of economic development back and forth, the cheapest labor coming in from China to do factory work. And so that's a definite, the person then goes on, that same person's asking about doctors in Ohio who are Chinese doctors who may have had a similar connection. I don't know anything about that, but obviously we have a lot of back and forth. You know, China is, if we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood infiltration, and we should, just the notion of Chinese and the Chinese government infiltration into every part of America.
Well, this is where we're looking at the red-green axis. We're talking about communism and the problem with Islamic supremacism, Islamization as well. And what you're saying there, the core issue is there is still travel going on between Americans and Canadians to other countries. As much as there are efforts to close the border, we still have travels going on. It's only going to slow when the airlines start saying, which they're doing now, we're not running anymore in these countries, to these countries back and forth, because it's become non-profitable. But that is a problem we're facing today. Under the Constitution, can we really say no to an American trying to come back home? Could we say no to a Canadian? But we could certainly, as we saw, unfortunately, the opposite with the rebel media news clip there, we could certainly screen them. If Pakistan is doing it from the point of view of taking their temperature, surely we could have some kind of an advanced method of testing these people and forcing them into quarantine, not just, well, how are you feeling today? We trust that you'll put yourself into quarantine. This is a major loophole, a major door that still has not been closed. Traveling back and forth with people with dual citizenship or people who are American or Canadian citizens that are still traveling abroad and pose an enormous risk to our countries.
Well, I think you can even just talk about residents, whether citizens or not in America. If you have residents who have not assimilated, and they don't feel part of the country, they were more associated with their home country and basically with their ideology.
Issue.
The notion that they're going to self-quarantine as a good, moral Judeo-Christian value system for my neighbor, that doesn't exist in some of these people's heads, and I think that's another concern we have. millions of people in America, who basically have no allegiance and therefore self-quarantine may not mean anything to them.
You see, that's food for thought. I'll tell you what the trend is. Right now, ISIS has told its members to stay away. Now, this is interesting because ISIS follows the letter of the Hadiths and the Sunnah and the Quran in the 7th century. But they're telling their people to stay away and don't travel to Europe. This is a curse. Don't travel to places. Don't travel to China, anywhere where you can get the virus. But the problem is, if they get it, that's another story, because if they get it, they could spread it. And who says they won't do it as a form of jihad? I remember a guy named Tawfiq Hamid, Dr. Tawfiq Hamid, who was in my book. He described the hatred of these Muslim Brotherhood types and these jihadists. And he says, the West can't comprehend the kind of hatred. They will kill you however they can, whether it be through bombs, whether it be through, he said, biological warfare. They will do anything to get at you and become a martyr. So it should be common sense. If a jihadist gets infected with the disease, do you really think he's going to stay home and try to do his due citizenship responsibility in the West and not infect anybody? Question mark.
Well, if he's a good jihadist, he would try to infect other fellow potential jihadists so that the weaponization could continue. I mean, again, this is just the extreme opposite of our normal thinking process and our value system. Person says, I want to mention that in World War II, the Japanese had suicide fighters who weren't afraid to die. When Americans dropped the bomb, the atomic bomb, they surrendered. Not saying that we should do that, but this shows that a solution can be found and implemented in the face of people who supposedly are not afraid to die. I think the person is making a point just to make that point. We're not suggesting that reaction, but the harsh reality is we have life and death going on all around us, and most people are oblivious to their own mortality. I think now most people are thinking about mortality a lot more. So
while there's a certain segment that's teaching their following that, and this is the teaching, do not be afraid of death. Death in the way of Allah is martyrdom. This is a segment of the population, a significant one, and this is what they're being taught. So like everybody else, as you're mentioning, Dick, who don't want to die, don't want their families to get it. Well, of course, they don't want to get it themselves, but they're being taught, don't be afraid to die. When it comes to the religion, when it comes to gathering, don't be afraid to die. And that is just a different way of thinking. And this is what we're grappling with in our nations. As you put it, we have this mindset among us.
Okay, well, I think that pretty much wraps up our questions for this evening. Again, a rapid fire evening with the news analysis. Christine, thank you very, very much. Why don't you remind everybody how they can follow your work? I see daily postings. Why don't you give a little bit of background on that, please?
Yeah, just go to jihadwatch.org and you'll see the daily writings and you'll learn a lot of information. I've written extensively. I have 2 books, The Challenge of Modernizing Islam and Fired by the Government of Canada for Criticizing Islam. And both of these could be obtained through Amazon.
And I will put some of those links up on the posting of this webinar as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great to have everybody and great to be with you again, Dick and Mary.
We wish you to be safe so we can see you again in a few weeks. We really appreciate your commitment to us and our team. Thank you, Mary. Just a footnote, tomorrow night we have another webinar. The webinar is going to feature our guest, Phyllis Chesler. She's going to talk about Islamic gender apartheid, all about women in Islam. Chilling. You'll see her story. I'll just give you a hint. One of her books is entitled A Bride in Kabul. So she has firsthand experience on the way women are treated, and it's going to be a very pointed message for American women, Muslim and non-Muslim. I don't think you want to miss that. I want to make an announcement. I forgot to put into the announcement and that we sent out to everybody. We have a 3rd webinar this week. People want webinars. We have wonderful people and wonderful content. This content comes to us on Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. If you're registered for tonight, you will get a reminder. Please come and join us. This is Global Faith is the name of the organization. Dr. Mark Christian is a former Muslim from Egypt. He actually was an imam and now he's a Christian, and he has tremendous insights. He has, actually, it's another news analysis program. It's a lot about the Middle East, including things about the Saudi oil activities and what's happening. How can India deal with the Muslims that are in its country? So it's very, very interesting, and it's again based on news analysis. So please join us Thursday night at 7 p.m. And with that, we'll say goodnight to Mary and Christine and all of you. Thank you very, very much.
Good night.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe, everybody.
Good night, everybody.